very hearty welcome to our one participant today. So, we are going to talk about ecology as well as the response of organisms to stimuli, since those were the topics of the second exam. So first, let's go into ecosystems a little. So, for one, ecosystems are distributed around the world by usually the climate conditions, temperature, precipitation, and so on. So that is how they are impacted by geological events. This, for example, is the perspective or hypothesized climate of various regions of Pangaea, the continent that existed several hundred million years ago. So you will notice that, of course, near the equator, it's always going to be warmest. And it says that was tropical summer wet, you had tropical ever wet, and winter wet. These are climate conditions we don't really have now, so the ecology of these areas may be very different from what we know today. Of course, species do change through time, so it's obviously different. Meteorological events can have an impact as well. So, for example, in the Carboniferous period, there were larger amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. There are reports of fossils and evidence of remains of organisms, insects, for example, that were like a meter long. So if you like creepy crawlies, this is your era. And also because of the climate, there were these giant swampy forests that formed. And then when things fell into them and started partially decomposing but didn't fully decompose, and then got buried under a lot of stuff, that's what actually gave rise to our modern coal formations that we use for energy. Now, so changes in atmospheric conditions also have an impact on ecosystems, because if they impact the amount of sunlight that's coming in, they can change the productivity, primary productivity of plants in an ecosystem. So this example is 1816, which was known in Europe as the year without a summer. There were a couple of factors that combined to lower temperatures around the world by almost a full degree Celsius. And this was caused by the eruption of a couple of volcanoes within a couple of years span. And when volcanoes erupt, they also spit out a lot of ash that, when it ends up in the sky, starts seeding cloud formation. And so not only were things colder, they were also cloudier. So there are records of famines and riots over lack of food because the productivity of plants was lower, and so a lot of the crops died. Then we can use models to predict some of these things, like changes in climate. So for example, this graph right here shows the predictions of several different climate change models. And this is the temperature change on this axis versus the year. So if things happen according to the variables that they input for this yellow climate change model, then we are screwed, because there's as much as a 4-degree temperature change. Whereas if we are increasing climate to the point where it follows this green model, we might be mostly okay. I mean, a 2-degree climate shift is still pretty catastrophic, pretty drastic, because this is a change in the average temperature of the whole planet. And some places will change temperature even more dramatically. Now, how do we measure like the health of an ecosystem? We have a couple of different measures. We can measure species richness, which is just sheerly how many species are there in an ecosystem. But that is not as accurate, because you would count every single individual of each species. So you would say, okay, I've got one of species 12 over here. I've got 300 of species 11 over here. And it doesn't really take that into account, how many you have of each species. Whereas species diversity is a different measurement that does that. So it combines your species richness with something called evenness. And that sees how your species are distributed. Do you have a lot of one species more so than another? Because that's going to affect your ecosystem health and also affect what your biodiversity is. So for an example, we have two different communities, Community 1 and Community 2, and the species richness for each of them is 5. So there are 5 different species represented here. Well, technically 4, I'm sorry, different diagram. Now, the first community, community 1, has all of the species evenly spread out. You'll see here there's 25% of A, 25% of B, and C and D. That would have the highest diversity because there's lots of representatives of each species. On the other hand, this would have lower diversity because you have mostly one species dominating and very few members of other species. So the more evenly distributed community has greater species diversity. I think these are actually 2 separate examples. So this is the diagram example, and the wordy example is the first community has 100 individuals and 80 were all one species. It's not an individual distribution. And then you have a second community where it's all evenly distributed. Okay. So the reason why diversity is important is because it allows an ecosystem to respond to changes and still maintain ecosystem health, still have the same number of species, not have them all die out or the ecosystem basically break down and chaos rules and everything's on fire. So what you have is 2 different species represented by the blue and the green dots. If you have a diverse community, like what you see at the top, if you have the first year that you're looking at this, you have average climate day, average temperature data. So it's not too hot, not too cold. Let's say the next year you have an extra warm year or warm summer. Notice that the composition has changed a little. There's less of the blue species, but there's still the same number of individuals there, and there's still a way for like this species can repopulate when the temperature is more ideal. Like here, the next year, it was a cold year. Species green does not do as well in the cold, so there ends up being more of species blue, but there is still some diversity, and this ecosystem will probably be able to survive and adapt to any changes in the climate. Like if instead of it being just cold one year, if the temperature started like steadily decreasing. On the other hand, if you had a community that was mostly blue, what happens to it when the temperature warms? Well, you have less individuals. Cold year comes and they're able to reproduce. But what if the temperature kept getting warmer and warmer? Do you think these guys would survive? On the other hand, if you look at the green community, if there was a community that was mostly them, they do fine when it's warm, but what happens when the temperature drops? Well, their population drops as well. So if the temperature stayed cold or continued to get colder, do you think they would survive? So what would survive best is this mix of species. So the more diversity you have, the better able an ecosystem is to weather and withstand all these changes in climate that can happen. So let's talk populations. A population is defined as a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. And based on how the individuals in the population interact with each other, that can determine properties of the population, like how fast it grows, or how it's distributed. Are they located mostly along riverbanks? Are they found only in forests? Are they found only in one particular forest? And this can be determined by how the individuals interact with each other and with their environment. So these are some of the characteristics that populations have. The size, growth, so how fast do they grow? Density, are they spread out or are they very concentrated? Distribution, are they spread out evenly or are they kind of clumped together in groups, or are they spread out randomly? And then finally, survivorship curves, which are basically, well, we'll talk about them more towards the end of ecology, but they are, do most of the organisms die off early, or do most of the organisms live for most of the lifespan? So population size is increased by births and immigration, anything that adds to the population, and it's decreased by deaths or emigration, where you're exiting a population. So this is the equation for calculating the population growth rate. I don't think I've seen any questions on the released AP test that cover population growth rate, but I just wanted to give it to you just in case. It's a fairly simple formula. It's the difference between whatever your two populations are, so your ending population and your beginning population, and you divide that by the amount of time that's passed. You can use this data, and if you have other data, you can calculate not only growth rate, you can calculate the birth rate and the death rate, because that will help you figure out whether the population is going to increase or decrease. Of course, if your birth rate is higher than your death rate, that means your population will go up because you're adding more than you're taking away. However, if your death rate is higher than your birth rate, that's going to make your population go down because more are leaving the population than are entering. There are two major types of growth and growth curves that we'll see. The J curve is exponential growth. So it basically looks like if you graphed like y equals x squared or something like that. And that's why it's exponential. The rate of increase just keeps going up, up, up. This is not the kind of growth that you'll see for very long in nature, because as your population gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it needs more resources. It tends to fill up the space it has available, and it tends to produce waste. You can kind of see that with humans. Our population has exploded in the last couple of 100 years. And now we have a really big problem with what do we do with our trash and our waste, because we're producing so much more of it. So this is usually limited, and usually a species will approach a carrying capacity. They may go over it, but what will usually happen is the death rate will grow if that happens, because the environment can't support more, and then the population will lower to around the carrying capacity. So this this creates a You are now on YouTube, child. Can you grab the recycling quietly? Erin says hi, everybody. All right. So this is called an S curve because it's shaped like an S, stretched out wonky S, but still an S. It does start with exponential growth. Usually you introduce something, a species to an area. As they have lots of resources, more than they need, their population grows exponentially. But at a certain point, their growth rate slows down because they start running out of resources. And so at first, their birth rate is super high, their death rate may be lower, maybe not be super low, but it's definitely lower than the birth rate. And up here, the death rate starts to get around close to even with the birth rate. So for any ones that you're taking into the population, you're also removing the same amount. And there is no way... God dang it. You are now on YouTube, child. Can you tell everyone else not to go through that door?
What happened?
Can you tell everyone else not to go through that door?
All right.
And don't come back this way, please.
All right.
That's also on YouTube now. Joy. All right, so let's move on. Population density is important because there are some factors called density dependent factors that when the density of a population goes up, they start to have an increasing impact. So some of those are things like disease, predation, resources, and waste production. So I already talked about waste production a little bit, but disease. Disease spreads easier when everybody's packed closer together because usually disease requires transmission of a pathogen, a bacterium or a virus, and you need to get it to the next individual. So if they're really close to each other, the chance they'll come in contact and be able to pass on the pathogen is higher. Predation. Predators will find it a lot easier to hunt in a field with 100,000 bunnies. They'll be able to catch them more easily. Whereas if you had only 10 bunnies in that same field, the predators would have a harder time finding prey to eat. Resources are also density dependent. Obviously, the more you have, The more population you have, the less resources each individual gets, and the more competition there is. There are some things, though, that are density independent. It doesn't matter how large the population is, how closely packed it is, these things are going to affect it regardless. So things like natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, etc., and the unnatural disaster humans, if humans are taking away habitat, let's say they're building a city, then they'll have an effect regardless of how dense the population is. So, depending on different interactions, species will tend to distribute themselves like so. They will either be clumped. This tends to happen with pack animals or animals that prefer to live in groups. It can also happen when you have resources concentrated at certain areas, and so plants may start growing. So if you look at a desert, there will be oases, and those are areas that actually have water, and you'll have lots of plants grow there, and then you won't find another plant perhaps until you reach the next oasis. On the other hand, this uniform distribution is something that is often a result of competition. You can see it very easily in plants. So, for example, this creosote bush might be releasing a toxin into the area around it that will kill any creosote trees that try to grow within a certain range. Notice, does this look like it's very wet, or does it look like it's pretty dry? Looks dry. And so it's probably not getting a ton of precipitation, and if these trees grew too close to each other, they probably wouldn't get enough water. And then you have a random dispersal. So dandelions just grow wherever their seeds land, and it's not like there's a pattern to how they land. So, for example, each of these shapes is outlining the roots of a particular creosote tree, and notice there's not very much overlap. The only overlap is in these blue shaded sections, and notice it's very tiny compared to the areas that are just dominated by one plant's roots. So they're definitely basically spreading out to make sure that everybody can get some nutrients. Probably water is the limiting resource here. You can also have an impact from symbiotic relationships. For example, you can do a predator-prey graph where you track the populations of both of them and see the relationship. So, for example, a spike in the prey population usually precedes a spike in the predator population, and together the prey and the predator kind of control each other's population. This has been seen in a lot of places where the predators have been removed, like wolves or sharks, and then you'll see the prey populations explode out of control. There's also parasitism, predation, mutualism, and commensalism. Those are some of the symbiotic relationships. So we just talked about predation. Parasites can affect populations because they can spread disease. 2, they can decrease survival. So if they take your blood or they take your resources from you, you have a lower chance of survival. Mutualism is when 2 species are interacting in a way where they benefit each other. Best example of that is bees pollinating flowers. The bees get food out of it, they get honey and nectar, and the flowers get something, they get the ability to pollinate other flowers that may not be nearby because the bees accidentally carry their pollen around. Commensalism is kind of hard to prove in nature, but it's when one species benefits and the other one isn't affected. The best example I can think of for this is the shark and the remora. So a remora is a type of fish that has like a suction cup on its head, and it attaches to the side of a shark. The shark may not even know it's there. It's not affected by this remora, and the remora, as the shark swims through the debris from its meal, the remora gets a meal.
Isn't that kind of like barnacles on whales?
So, yeah. So I'm trying to think. So the barnacles aren't taking any nutrients from the whales. So the whales shouldn't be affected unless they're like allergic and get a rash or something. So yeah, barnacles, that would be a commensal relationship too. And then you can create models. You can create computer models when you have computers to try to predict what's going to happen. So, for example, this is an invasion curve. If an invasive species moves into an area, you'll notice at first it has some exponential growth. And it's also marking on here where it's feasible or easy to eradicate or prevent their spread, or areas like up here where their population is super huge, they've infested a large area, and you can just kind of manage them. You're not going to get rid of them necessarily. Epidemiological models would be models of the spread of disease. There's another type of interaction, and that is competition. So, two major types. You have intraspecific. Anything with intra means within. So something that is intracellular would happen inside of a cell. This is within the same species. It's usually for resources or it can be for mates. In fact, a lot of some of the spectacles we see in nature, like if you ever watch the Planet Earth series or Life series, they'll show a lot of two members of the same species competing with each other for mates. It's the entire reason like elk and moose have antlers. Well, not the entire thing, but most of it. Then there's interspecific, so that's between two species. So I got an example up here, and that's a bear and a wolf fighting over what looks like a carcass. Although on closer look, it looks like a wolf, so maybe the wolf is just trying to protect the other wolf.
It's like a dead deer.
It does?
Yeah.
I'm seeing something weird. We're going to assume it's a dead deer and that they're competing over that, because that makes me less sad than the other one. This is a slide I didn't get to finish, but abiotic factors can also have an impact on populations. For example, water and nutrient availability, that's pretty obvious. There's no water, there's no life. So life tends to cluster around sources of water and sources of food. For plants, that would be nutrients in the soil. For animals, that would be plants to eat. Temperature can have an impact. Every species has an optimal temperature range that it's most comfortable living in. If you have them living in a higher temperature or a lower temperature, it usually puts more stress on their body and it decreases their survival because, like for example, if the temperature is super warm, they're going to have to spend a lot of energy. If they're humans, sweating or doing something to try to reduce their temperature, and they're going to be using energy for that instead of for growth or reproduction. Salinity is really important when you talk about aquatic creatures. So that's the amount of salt that you have. All aquatic creatures have a range of salinities they can live in. If you take a freshwater fish and plunk them in salt water, they won't live. Same thing if you take a saltwater fish and plunk them in fresh water. And it has to do with osmosis. Ha ha ha.
That makes sense.
Yeah, they can't regulate their osmotic balance. So a freshwater fish put in a saltwater environment would start losing a lot of the water from its body into the surroundings because the surrounding area is hypertonic, has a lot more stuff dissolved in it, all the salts, and so they would just start losing water like crazy. A saltwater fish put in a freshwater environment would start gaining water. So the water would start moving into the fish and then it would puff up. Not like a puffer fish, in a bad way. All right. The pH is also important, both on land and in the water. For example, plants have a certain range of pHs they can grow in. If you make it more acidic or more basic, they can't grow well. At a certain part of the range, their growth will be stunted, and then you go beyond that range and they'll just die.
Yeah, it's also like with freshwater fish, like the water has to be a certain pH or they'll just end up dying.
Yeah, so if you have an aquarium, you've got to monitor all of these factors if you want your fish to be healthy.
Yeah, pH strips are like expensive for fish. You can like get only like 5 for $5.
Oh wow, that is expensive. There's a reason I don't have fish. All right, let's talk about energy now. So, everybody needs energy. That's what we were talking about in class. Organisms have ways to get energy. Plants tend to capture it from the sun. Animals tend to capture it from the plants. And we use it for all these purposes listed up here. Keep our enzymes functioning, keep our proteins in shape, keep our cellular structures, etc., to grow and also to reproduce. And from an evolutionary standpoint, the reproduction is the important part. So a lot of adaptations that organisms have are related to how they get energy. Getting energy or saving energy. And if you change the amount of energy that's available, like for example, when that year without a summer, when there was a lot less sunlight coming down, that can dramatically impact the population size. So the populations of a lot of plant species probably decrease during that time. So, just like what we talked about when we're talking about metabolism, the second law of thermodynamics has a role here. Basically, as you have an energy transformation, each time you have one, that increases what's called entropy, which is disorder. And we can also say that when you have each energy transformation, some of that is turned into background heat and is no longer available for an organism to use. So this is why you have like less than 100% ecological efficiency. You never get 100% of the energy of the organism you ate. That's where we get also what you learned freshman year is the 90-10 rule, where 90% of the energy gets lost to heat. Yeah. Though we did calculations earlier in the year where we saw that that ratio can actually vary some. So, energy cannot be recycled, so you need a constant input of energy like so in order to keep an ecosystem running. You can recycle matter, so matter is recycled by decomposers and then taken back into the food chain by the primary producers, but energy cannot be recycled. So, all of the ecosystems that we know of depend on producers for their energy source, and they're impacted by the primary productivity, which is the amount of sugar that they're able to create, or the amount of energy they're able to capture from, in the case of photosynthesizing creatures, from sunlight and turn into chemical energy. So autotrophs capture that from the environment. We talked today about how most of those autotrophs are photosynthesizers, but there are some performing chemosynthesis. And so when you change primary productivity, you change the amounts that you have of other organisms as well, because without plants, you have no ecosystem. So if you have a reduction in the amount of plants, there's usually going to be a reduction in the amount of all the other organisms too. So net primary productivity depends on two factors: how much light you get and how much water you have. So that's why you have a lot of very focused areas of high productivity near the equator, because not only is it the warmest and the most intense year-round sunlight, it's also some of the wetter areas. So that's why you have tropical rainforests in this area. Notice that kind of north of that and a little south of that, you have more areas with low productivity, and that's because those tend to be deserts. So the lack of water reduces productivity, and then of course up near the top, what's reducing productivity is the fact that you're just receiving less sunlight period in a year than something at the tropics. There's a difference between net and gross productivity. You can relate this to income too. So your your gross is the total that you make. So for example, if you're counting glucose molecules made during photosynthesis, your gross might be you get 5 glucose molecules. But your net is your total after discounting anything that you had to use. So let's say you had to use the equivalent of the energy in 1 glucose molecule to actually produce those 5. Well, your net, or like your profit, is the 4 extra glucose molecules you made. It's kind of like in glycolysis, like what we talked about. You start off by actually using 2 of your ATP, but in the end, you make 4 ATP. Your gross production of ATP would be 4, but you didn't really make 4 brand new ones. You ended up only gaining 2 total. That's your net gain, would be 2 ATP. That make sense? Excellent. So, based on the amount of energy that's available, different organisms will adopt different reproductive strategies. They can be an R strategist or a K strategist. K, by the way, stands for the carrying capacity. These guys tend to have a slower growth rate, and they tend to stabilize at the carrying capacity. R strategist, the R we can say stands for rapid, because they reproduce really quickly. And you can see, I tend to call this quantity over quality. They have a crap ton of babies and hope a few of them will survive to pass on their genes. So for example, roaches may lay like a lot of eggs. Rabbits breed like rabbits. Fish can lay thousands of eggs in one sitting, depending on the species. And so those would all be examples of R strategists. Their offspring tend to mature very quickly, tend to reach sexual maturity very quickly, so they can start reproducing as soon as possible. And they tend to be smaller.
Like hamsters.
Yes. Or rabbits.
They sexually mature like 3 to 4 weeks.
Wow. Okay, so that's really
gestation
rapid.
is 18 days.
No way.
Yeah, my hamsters, they bred together on accident because my hamster snuck into her cage and like they ended up having babies, and I didn't realize she was pregnant until one day before she gave birth.
Oh wow. That is crazy.
Yeah, almost all of her babies survived except one the other day. It died because it was a runt and like they ate it.
The parents or the babies?
Like the babies and the parents.
Oh.
I don't have the parents together because she would eat all of them.
Dang. That's crazy. On the other hand, K strategists don't produce very many offspring, but they care for them quite a bit. So they're going for quality over quantity. They'll have fewer offspring in their lifetime, but they will care for them longer. They'll put a lot of energy into raising them. So the ultimate K strategist that I think of is an elephant. Because elephants are pregnant for almost 2 years. And their offspring tend to be larger. They tend to take longer to mature, so they'll spend a large amount of time with their parents. So elephants will stay with their moms for a while. And if you put all that energy in to be pregnant for almost 2 years and raise a gigantic elephant calf, I'm sure you'd be like, nah, you stay next to me. I need to make sure you live. So their populations have a slower growth rate.
Have you ever seen a baby roach?
No. I don't like roaches, so I don't look them up.
Me too, but now I want to see a baby roach because like you're talking about how the K strategists, they spend more time with their babies, and I just imagine a roach spending time with their babies. Like for like a day, they're like, this is how you walk.
No, they lay their eggs and they probably don't come back to them. Yeah, they're the only insects that I know of that really care for their offspring might be bees. Maybe wasps, because they have them in the nest and they care for them there. But their babies are larvae, so they look more like worms.
Like ants also, do you consider? Because like they have them in their colonies.
Yeah, they might care for their offspring, but I still think the insects are strategists though, because they can produce large amount of offspring. Like the only one who's reproducing in a beehive is the queen bee, and she basically spends her whole life popping out egg after egg after egg. Not a pleasant existence in my mind, but so then there are survivorship curves. This is very closely related to R and K strategists. If